Hi, I'm Leah Toro. I'm kind of fighting off the end of a cold right now, so if I sound fucked up, don't mention it. And subscribe, because I'm recording with a fucked up voice. And in other news, about a month ago, or at least a while ago, Netflix had debuted their new true crime drama series, Monster, a Jeffrey Dahmer story, which is a series on the platform which focuses on telling the story of Jeffrey Dahmer from when he was a child to his time as a killer, and then to his eventual death in prison, where he got mollywopped by an inmate. And the series gratefully adds to the seemingly never-ending list of Jeffrey Dahmer content, because God knows we don't have enough TV specials, documentaries, movies, and reenactments of the case. And I don't know if you can tell, but I don't like this series. I don't like it at all. I consider myself to be a very big Jeffrey Dahmer content hater. I believe that his story is told way too many times. This guy's been given a legacy through this constant publicization, even decades after the case took place. And there comes to a point in which there's really no new ways you can analyze a crime, because content about Jeffrey Dahmer has been around since the early 1990s. So every aspect and minute detail about this case, every social rhetoric and issue that's present within it, has been criticized, analyzed, and speculated on genuinely to every atom. And it's not that I don't think that people should be discussing aspects of this case, or that some of the issues present within the Dahmer case that's being talked about in the show aren't still present today and shouldn't still be discussed. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that Jeffrey Dahmer's case specifically is one that's told way too many times. We don't need to hear about it again. But alas, we are. And it's not good. So, as you can imagine, I'm not the only person who feels this way. If you were on Twitter or TikTok in really the height of the show's release, you would see a lot of tweets and TikToks and conversations in which they criticized aspects of the show and ways that certain issues were treated within it. And I feel like, for the most part, a lot of issues that people had with the show, myself included, stemmed from the fact that this was a true crime drama series, which is kind of this sub-genre of true crime content, if you're unfamiliar with it, that mainly focuses on taking a real-life crime, taking a real-life case, and then reenacting the entire thing with actors and music, ambiance, sets, etc., turning it more into a show or a movie of sorts, rather than a display and coverage of a case. And that's what I want to talk about in this video. I don't like true crime drama series, and Dahmer is no exception. In fact, Dahmer is the straw that's breaking the camel's back. Fuck this show. So, to better understand, the divide between people and true crime drama series, I feel like you really have to understand that when it comes to large-scale productions of true crime content, you typically either get one of two things. You get a documentary, or you get, a drama series. It's one or the other all the time. And whilst both, depending on, the case, the director, who commissioned the series, etc., a lot of people tend to turn to documentaries as the primary and most ethical source of true crime content, because, relatively speaking, it kind of is. See, when it comes to discussing true crime content, even online, a lot of people will debate the point in which true crime content stops being ethical and when it stops being defendable. But the general consensus is that true crime content stops being ethical and it stops being defendable the moment the content is no longer about the case, nor is it taking into consideration the feelings of those impacted and affected by the case. With things like documentaries, you tend to get this kind of reassurance that what you're watching is, in fact, taking the most careful route when covering the case. It's taking into account the feelings of the families and the surviving victims and their families. Because typically with documentaries, like I said, it really does depend. You often get input from detectives who worked on the case at the time. You get insight from journalists who are covering the case. You get to hear stories about survival from the victims. It is a more analytical and straightforward approach when talking about a case. It lays everything out for you. It explains away any fly details, and really makes sure that at the end of the day, you're walking away with the notion that you have just learnt something, essentially. It's meant to be more of an educational experience. And once again, you get that reassurance that the families are being taken into account when covering the case. With true crime drama series, it's just not something that you can be assured of. True crime dramas in its entirety is definitely meant to be more of an entertainment-focused medium. You can't argue that at the end of the day, the purpose of them, for the most part, is that it's trying to give you some pleasurable viewing experience. Its job isn't to take a case and break it down for you and explain away all the details and give you a bunch of insight. Its purpose is to make sure that you're seated for when the show ends, and that you're going to press keep watching when Netflix tells you that there's another similar series that you can watch. Families tend to be the biggest thing that a lot of people will point out when talking about true crime cases and their coverage, because, the victims' families are out there. They can come across this media. It's their story and their trauma. And with true crime drama series, the participation and the accountants of these families is not something you always get. So, for example, in 2018, FX dropped The Assassination of Gianni Versace, a True Crime Story, which was this little series that aired that covered the death of Gianni Versace and the social political circumstances surrounding his death and how the Versace family had reacted in the wake of his death. Which, okay, that's something. This series got a lot of praise. It was given amazing ratings. People were loving it all around. So you'd think, yeah, there's no problem with the series. If, you ignore the fact that the family of Versace had come out and said to dismiss everything in the show as if it was a work of fiction because so much shit was fabricated and just, not true. And I found that this wasn't an isolated issue or one that only happened in a few true crime drama series, but rather that this is a consistent issue that the genre seems to have. Something both very interesting and very unfortunate about true crime drama content is that because of the mode of storytelling that they use, they don't have the privileges and abilities that one would get when making a documentary. So in documentaries, you get to sit down and have people put all the facts of the case on display, explain details, make sure that you understand that certain things maybe don't have an explanation, or that certain aspects are more important than others. But because true crime drama series don't have a bunch of people sitting down and explaining the parts of a case to you, they kind of have to improvise when certain things don't line up in the narrative line that they're creating. With any kind of true crime content, there tends to be a pipeline that the directors and creators follow in order to tell people about a case. And based on the production and what they want to cover, this pipeline will span different lengths of time throughout the case. Like, let's say a documentary wants to focus the investigation and the eventual capture of a killer. So it'll focus on their active time as a killer from the first case to their capture. Or if a documentary wants to talk about the killer's background and backstory, essentially, it'll be focused on the life of the killer's parents to how the killer grew up, any kind of outside sources and aspects that played a role into how they developed, and certain things that really played a big role into making them the person they ended up being today, or at the end of the case. And those are very cookie-cutter pipelines, and because they're told in documentary form, they get the chance to explain literally everything. So even if something doesn't seem to have a direct explanation, they can still cover a good amount of ground and speculate a good amount because they have people to come in and talk about that stuff. True crime dramas don't really get that privilege because what they're doing is they're using a narrative storyline to portray this case. So it's less of covering a specific time period and more of covering things as they happened. And that's unfortunate because major parts of a case or its investigation or even the background to a case has to be cut out for the sake of making sure the story is as clear-cut as possible. The true crime genre isn't one that's very straightforward because crime itself isn't a very straightforward thing. There's plenty of aspects, social, political, and environmental, that play into a case, its investigation, how it's carried out. When you choose a mode of storytelling that totally cuts out your ability to explain all of those facts and details, you kind of have to improvise and take some creative liberties, which I don't think is something you should do if you're trying to give people, like any kind of information. So they care less about making sure you walk away with a decent understanding of a case, and more so that you walk away feeling thoroughly entertained and like you just watch any other horror movie or dramatic murder mystery TV show. Because that's exactly what they portray themselves as. So, whenever the directors and creators come across points in a case where certain things, like, need more attention to explain or need more context, or genuinely just need to be examined more for people to really understand it to the best of their abilities, they kind of go, this wouldn't fit in the storyline that we're creating, so we have to make some shit up. So it makes more sense from a narrative perspective. I think they kind of had to throw in something that would still give you that wow factor and make you feel like, yeah, that's something outlandish enough to create a necrophilic serial killer, which is good if you were telling, like, a story about a non-real killer in a non-real town with non-real victims. But when you're covering a real-life case involving real-life people, that begins to be a problem because now you're just willfully spreading misinformation, and people are walking away with a completely twisted and fucked up view of the case. I mean, seeing how some people are commenting in regards to aspects of the show and by association aspects of the case is fucking wild, dude. And it's really fucked up because I've seen people like really not grasp that this show is about real events because it's not being portrayed to them as such, and so they're really just taking it in as though it was any other horror movie or TV show. Because, like I said, this is an entertainment-driven genre. Oh, wait, Leah, add this to the part where you're talking about the taxidermy thing. Fun fact, the taxidermy thing didn't happen, but it reminded me about how My Friend Dahmer, which was another dramatization of Dahmer's childhood, starring Ross Lynch, they have this whole, like, bit where Dahmer is really into taxidermy and his dad is like very against the fact that he's into taxidermy. And so there's this entire scene where his dad like fucks his shit up and tells him to be normal. So what I'm saying is that the mythos essentially that this show has created actively contradicts like the way that the story is being told in others. So imagine how fucking confusing that must be for other people. Yeah, back to what I was saying before. And I know, someone's probably thinking, well, Leah, it's described as a drama series. No one's really walking into this show and then walking away thinking that they were going to get some real and accurate depiction of a case. And I challenge that with, why the fuck would they think that's not what they're getting? First off, it's in the true crime genre, and it's being produced by a major company. Most people would assume that given the fact that it has true crime in the title, and features, a real killer, that it would be just telling you about the crime. It would be depicting real information. And even then, the way people treat it like it's just another show isn't something that's just happening because people don't have critical thinking skills. It's also happening because Netflix itself is treating it like it's just another TV show. There was this tweet, and I'm going to paraphrase it so hard right now, where Netflix was like thinking about this scene from Dahmer, where one of Dahmer's victims manages to escape, and the police bring him back. Something about streaming the show. And I was like, what the fuck? That's weird. Because this wasn't just some plot point in a show, this was genuinely how a kid met their end. And it's kind of fucked up to tweet about it like it's just some new dramatic sequence of events that the show happens to get. Anyway, watch the show on Netflix, streaming now. That's weird, bro. It's weird. And it especially gets me fucked up in regards to real people. One of the biggest issues to come from the show's release is that one of the victim's sisters, she'd given a very emotional and very personal and heart-wrenching victim impact statement in a courtroom where Dahmer was present, talking about how, like, just broken she was over the fact that her brother was gone. And it's just, like, very emotional, and it's one of the biggest parts of this entire case, because it really does, like, let you see how much of a tragedy it was and how much heartbreak it caused. And so, you know what Netflix decided to do after watching and listening to such an impactful and emotional statement? They said, how quickly can we find someone who looks and sounds exactly like her? And the answer was very fast. They had recreated the entirety of her testimony, like, word for word, and just put it in the show. And they didn't tell the family about this, mind you. Isabel had no idea that this was happening, and she had found out about it via other people that she knew who watched the show and said, hey, that's literally my friend. And what happened was, essentially, she got to not only relive her trauma and unearth a bunch of feelings that she had, worked so hard to kind of get over. And I know someone else is going to go, well, actually, because it's public information or some shit, they don't have to tell the victims' families that they're doing anything with their footage or parts of their involvement in a case. And to that I say, fuck you, it's morally wrong, and I don't like it. And what I think frustrates me the most when it comes to, these true crime series, and it's not just how they don't care about the families, or they don't care about the victims, or really honoring them as much as they do glamorizing their murders, as well as just, like, never giving people, like, the information they need. On top of everything, one of the most upsetting things that they do is that they actively strive to kind of create a gap between the viewer and the criminal and their crimes. The best way I can describe it is like lenses. You have the viewer, and then you have the criminal and their crimes. And through the process of making these documentaries and shows and content, more and more filters get placed in between the viewer and their perception of whatever went on in the case. So it essentially tends to create this kind of barrier, and it really does change how people perceive, like, literally everything about the case, which is why it's so important for this kind of content to be made with, like, the utmost care and attention to make sure that people aren't walking away with the wrong idea. So when you take a real-life murderer and, his real-life victims, and you kind of just make him the conventionally attractive white boy of the week, give us all these funky shots and these cinematics and aesthetics, you kind of lose that humanity and that understanding of this was a real thing that happened. And whilst I assume most people have the sense to understand that this was real, the amount of times I've, like, listened to people talk about the show in real life and have to explain to their friends that it was real, it drives me, like, insane. And I know I've probably said this before, but I'm being so deadass. What's the purpose of these shows? Like, what's the purpose of taking a case and then recreating it with, like, actors and all this extra shit? Because, relatively speaking, it doesn't add anything to people's understanding of the case. If anything, it takes away major chunks of it, because people are willing to overlook so many aspects of it as just being a part of a TV show, or seeing that their favorite actor or favorite singer is playing a lead role, and that's kind of all they're there for. No one is watching this shit and going, oh, I've learned something so new and insightful about the case. No, it's giving you less information than literally any other piece of media would. What would a close-up, dramatized, and, like, fully reenacted murder scene of a real person make me understand about the case? Like, okay, I'm pretty sure a documentary could have told me that one of his victims was decapitated. Why would I need to see that in the show? It genuinely just doesn't make sense. Nothing is added to my understanding. I'm not saying that people need shit spelled out for them every time they want to look at something, but when it's, something based in history with real life effects and social, political issues that play into it and impacted it, and that really did shift people's understanding and their faith in the justice system, you kind of want to have all the facts in store and in your hand, so you don't walk away like those people who walked away from My Friend Dahmer talking about how pitiful they thought Dahmer was, and how they kind of ended up justifying the shit he pulled because he had such a sad life. What is the point of these shows? I hate them so bad. When the show had originally come out, the true crime consumption is my entire personality, true crime and wine crowd had kind of like made a trend out of talking about how non-traumatizing they found the series, how they've absolutely seen worse, and how they were able to eat little snackies while watching it. Anyone who said that they were like insensitive for doing so was kind of just not used to seeing the content as often as they were. There were even people who were talking about how they were disappointed in the lack of like gory detail in the murder scenes of these victims, because when you see like the actual photos and crime scene images, it's very fucked up, it's very brutal, and people were genuinely disappointed that they didn't get to see an accurate recreation of all of these murders to the T in the show. Which it's just a weird thing to be upset about when watching a series that's talking about real events. It's one thing to be mad that certain details were overlooked and certain aspects weren't talked about because they were important points of discussion and really did a good job in making sure that people understood the case, like it's a core issue within the case itself. And it's another thing to go, I wanted to see like live leak level content in a show. Like I've been saying this entire video, this isn't just a Dahmer-centric issue. The entire genre of true crime recreation and dramatization content is incredibly polluted. It's not a good subgenre of content because it really does add nothing to people's understandings of the case, nor does it add anything to the discussion of the case. It works as a breeding ground for people who want to romanticize or fetishize killers and their actions, and can excuse it all by saying that this isn't Jeffrey Dahmer in an edit, this is Ross Lynch, who just happens to be dressed as Jeffrey Dahmer. Or, this isn't me talking about how hot Jeffrey Dahmer is, this is me talking about how hot that guy from American Horror Story is. When I initially saw like all of those edits and stuff pop up, it reminded me of how people will walk around like with a 0-day profile picture and think it's totally fine, as if 0 Day wasn't like a direct recreation of Columbine. And I'm not saying that you can't enjoy an actor's performance when they're playing an unflattering or unpalatable role. I'm saying that if you're actively going, their actions as they play this character are so fun and attractive, gets weird when you remember that these are actions committed by a real person. And try to understand that I'm not trying to work as some kind of content tyrant and tell people that certain modes of media can't and shouldn't exist because it's too taboo, it's too topical. I'm all for people trying to find new ways in giving people information, especially on something as topical as, crimes and how they're investigated and how they're handled, because that is something that a lot of people should be aware of, and that's a conversation a lot of people should be having that we don't really get. But because of the form that this, true crime recreational content is making, the kind of people it's attracting, and just the current sphere of true crime content that we are in currently, it doesn't feel like this is the kind of content that we should be giving people. I feel like people are genuinely just not ready to see a case be explained in any way other than a documentary. And even then, a documentary is the most effective mode of conveying this information that, exists. So I don't really see why people are trying to go over it for any reason other than entertainment value. So yeah, man, fuck Dahmer, fuck true crime, drama, anything. Please stop recreating people's murders and then making me watch them. Okay, yeah, that's the video done. So, I still do not have an intro, so... I should check that. I'm drunk, maybe I should text back. You called, so maybe I should call back. I'm lost, show me where my friends at. Show me where my friends at. She's all like, baby, we should go now. You can leave, girl, I can get a ride down. Grab a train, you can blue or going southbound.